So today we're going to be checking out an interview with the director of Clair Obscur, Guillaume Broche, as he talks about the success of turn-based RPGs, but how there still seems to be a prejudice towards that genre. Does Sandfall have any plans to expand their team? And where does he see the AA gaming market headed in the future? So this interview with Guillaume comes to us from Automoton Media, who got to speak to him at the CEDEC conference in Japan, which is a huge gaming conference for Japanese developers. They invite a ton of people to just kind of hang out and talk shop. It's super cool. It also explains how Sandfall got to meet CS1 at the Square Enix studio, but also hang out with Hideo Kojima and his team. You see this a lot in Japanese game development. I wish we saw it more around the industry, but just seeing these devs get together, talk about their games, I think is super cool. But starting off first with turn-based JRPGs, they are finding more success lately, but there still seems to be a prejudice around them. Why does Guillaume think that? He would go on to say, I could talk about the prejudice forever. Personally speaking, I think Japanese turn-based RPGs were super popular up until the Xbox 360 era, but around the time open world games started getting more popular through gaming media, JRPGs started being considered uncool. He would then list the Persona series as being a bit of an outlier by saying, while they do still sell a large number of copies, with the Persona series as a prime example, I feel like the prejudice against turn-based RPGs isn't completely gone. To his first point there, I think he is right, and I think the reason is because in that Xbox 360 era, we had these consoles that were way more powerful than anything that had come before. The Xbox 360 was an incredibly user-friendly console for developers to use, and then you had the PS3, which was an over-engineered mess, incredibly frustrating. Only first-party devs really had an idea of how to properly use that console, and even then, not all first-party devs were successful in busting that thing open. But the main point is, developers now had more powerful hardware to bring even cooler, crazier ideas to life instead of what they had before. So you could now do these cool open world games that incorporated way more action, cool effects, explosions, what have you. And as a developer, I would think that would be very enticing. Now, as that stuff was happening, JRPGs did kind of fall to the wayside and were definitely deemed uncool. I hate using this word because it gets used a lot, but some JRPGs were viewed as being a bit cringy by other gaming audiences. They were super anime, super over the top, kind of had some weird humor and suggestive stuff at times. It was kind of viewed as something for like the weeaboo kids in high school. So I guess you could say that was a bit of a growing pains period for that genre of games. Now, to speak on the actual turn-based combat, I feel like there are people that love turn-based and there are the people that do not like it. When it comes to the latter, I think those people fall into two categories. And the examples I'm going to give are all anecdotal, just based on comments I've gotten on my YouTube channel and stuff I've seen online over the years. And obviously, people's gaming preferences are a spectrum. It's not just black and white, but for the purposes of this video, I'm just gonna keep it a little bit more black and white. But maybe you have someone who did play a turn-based game back in the day or at some point in their life, and they had a pretty bad experience with it, and that colored their entire perception of what a turn-based game could be. But maybe later down the line, they sat down and played a turn-based game and realized, wow, this is actually super cool and way better than I remember it. The other group of people are people that no matter what have never and will never play a turn-based game. They look at them, they think they're boring. Oh, this game looks super cool, but it's turn-based. I don't want to play that. I've seen some people say that about Clair Obscur. Yo, this game looks cool, but I don't like turn-based. I think the perception for some people is that turn-based is super boring and simple, but in reality, it can be very complex. When you sit down to play a turn-based game, there is so much strategy involved when it comes to your party lineup, their equipment and abilities, how the turns play out in battle. There's a lot of strategery going on in the old noggin in a turn-based combat situation. Some people may not like that. Some people may not even be aware that that is what's going to happen if they play a turn-based game. They just think it looks super simple and boring and they want something a little bit more action-focused. And even with something like Clair Obscur, again, I've seen people who are like, yeah, I don't want to play that because it's turn-based. There are some people who are die-hard turn-based fanatics that don't like the combat in Clair Obscur because of those reactive elements. They don't want to worry about dodging or parrying or jumping and counterattacking. They want to pick something, see it play out, have the enemy enemy do their thing, and then that's how combat plays out. So I get it. I personally really like this combat system. I think the reactive elements keep the player on their toes. It keeps them fresh. The different enemies have different attack speeds and surprise you with different combinations. Sometimes they'll hit you twice. Sometimes they'll hit you 80 frickin' times. You don't really know what's going to happen, but it keeps you guessing. Now, the flip side of that are people who love turn-based but cannot stand action. We see that with Final Fantasy. There's people that don't like modern Final Fantasy because it's either straight up action or it's a hybrid combat system. I personally love the hybrid combat system we have in the 7 Remake trilogy. It scratches that itch in my brain of the strategic aspect of turn-based ATB command-based menu system, but I also get to whack stuff in real time and do super cool flashy abilities. I think it's wonderful. But even though turn-based RPGs are starting to find more success, I think you're still always going to have an uphill battle with the people who are like, yo, that looks boring, until they actually, try to give it a chance. But games like Clair Obscur can help break that barrier and introduce more people into this genre. Which kind of reminds me of a quote from Yoshi P back when they were promoting Final Fantasy XVI. It was a controversial quote, but it was also a quote that was taken out of context by a number of outlets and people, and things got really muddy. The irony is that I myself don't remember the full extent of the quote, so I apologize if I get anything wrong, but I believe the gist was around turn-based combat and why it wasn't going to work with the type of game that they were making with that visual fidelity, i.e. Final Fantasy XVI. And when I first read that quote, I'm like, I see where he's coming from, but I don't fully agree with him. I disagree on certain aspects. And then I played Clair Obscur. And Clair Obscur is a game that eats, sleeps, and breathes art and painting. The theme of painting and art permeates that game, its story, its world, even the combat. And I think that's one of the reasons why turn-based works so well for Clair Obscur. It's not just 3 characters standing there whacking the enemy. The way the characters strut into battle, you see their personality on full display as they get into position to start this fight. As you're picking your abilities through the menus, the UI is super heavily influenced by painting. And then you pick an ability and it's like this really beautiful display of watercolors happening with the character, their animation, and the effects as they attack the enemy. It looks super, super beautiful, but it's also a sound effects thing. When a character or an enemy hits you with a big move like a gradient attack, it sounds like a paintbrush coated in paint being rinsed off in a bowl of water. And having played that, what Yoshi P said now makes full sense to me. It's like, oh, the story that the developers were trying to tell with Clair Obscur, art and paint, a story about grief, just naturally lends itself to turn-based because they were able to take the art and paint aspect of their story and incorporate it into the gameplay, because that was part of the narrative they wanted to tell. Whether or not they could have done that with Final Fantasy XVI, I don't know. I'm sure you could have made a turn-based version of 16, but you would have had to retool a lot of stuff because 16 was very much a single-player game focused on Clive. It was his story, and because of that, you had a lot of the characters fall to the wayside and you didn't have a party system. So I don't know if seeing Clive and Jill and Sid or Dion just kind of standing in a row doing their attacks would have been as effective with turn-based. I'm sure you could have still had the super cool looking moves, but I don't know if it really would have worked for the story they were trying to tell, because that story of 16, again, is Clive focused, heavy octane action, crazy blockbuster icon battles. So I think the action stuff just kind of lent itself better to Final Fantasy XVI, but that's just kind of how I see that quote and that conversation personally. So with JRPGs being uncool, was Sandfall adding reactive elements to their game in an attempt to make Clair Obscur cool? Guillaume goes on to say, it's not like we added the parry system and built such a narrative experience because we wanted to avoid our game facing prejudice. We just did it because we wanted to do it, which is dope. And again, we've touched on this in previous videos, so I won't spend too much time on it here. But one of the things you want to do as a developer is take something that you were influenced by and put your own spin on it and push the genre forward. And that's what Sandfall did. Sure, some of these aspects already existed in previous games, specifically the QTEs during combat, but adding a real-time parry system, a dodge mechanic, the ability to jump and counterattack, pushes this genre, in my opinion, forward. And they've now coined the genre of reactive turn-based, which is super sick. And by virtue of it being a small team, they could do something like that without having to go through so much red tape or higher ups being like, yeah, turn-based is not really that popular. We're just going to have you do a different game instead. So with the success of Clair Obscur, does Sandfall see themselves expanding their development team for the future? Guillaume goes on to say, I think that for now, I'd prefer working as a small team. I'm not sure how big an ideal team would be, he laughs, but when it comes to making a full-price turn-based RPG, I believe that the team we have now is just the right size. Guillaume would expand further by talking about how many people worked in each department for this game. He says, we had 5 people working on environments, 2 on the story, and I think around 3 to 6 people working on the cinematics. The music was done by 4 people. Now, when it comes to expanding, I would have to assume that, for their next game, whether it's a new IP or if they take Clair Obscur and turn it into an anthology series like a Final Fantasy where every game is new, it's different, standalone, I could see them maybe adding a few people, but you don't want to get so bloated that it becomes a complicated process to then make your game. The fact that they had a small team, which again, the core development team for this game was 32 people and a dog, which is 33, allowed them to make this game at their own pace and get those cool ideas in there. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't have other help. They did outsource for things like localization, QA, and a lot of the marketing stuff, and you see that everywhere in the credits. It's more than just 33 names. But that core team is what developed this game. But when you have such a small team and you also have a publisher like Kepler that, for the most part wasn't super hands-on, you can look at your partner and be like, okay, this cinematic is cool, but what if we added this? And then you can do that. There was an interview we covered a while back with Jennifer Svedberg-Yen, who is the game's writer. And there was a situation where the developers had made a cutscene that was so beautiful and moving that it inspired Jennifer to go back and rewrite her dialogue for that scene. So that's super cool how you can just kind of work and be inspired by one another and not really have to go through so much red tape to get something in. It's also interesting too, because during the hiring process for Sandfall, I think they interviewed like 200 plus people, and they ended up hiring a lot of people who were younger, fresh out of school, with less experience, which, don't get me wrong, it's nice to have veterans on the team. They are super experienced and they know what they're doing, but having a group of younger people is so vital, not just in gaming, but everywhere, because younger people bring a viewpoint, a lived experience that maybe older generations might be kind of out of touch with. They can bring a new perspective on how to make a game, how to approach a scene, how to write something, how to create a character. And you also have the added bonus of all of these people being younger, hungrier, and really wanting to prove themselves. So with Clair Obscur being a AA game and having so much success, how does Guillaume think that will affect the gaming industry? He goes on by saying, as development costs continue to grow, I think we're likely to see an increase in companies like ours, producing AA class games. Thanks to Unreal Engine, it's now easier to get an idea of the amount of resources you'll need relative to your production scale. This makes it possible to develop entertaining games efficiently, even with a relatively small team. 100% correct. In the gaming industry today, I've mentioned this before, gaming is something that started off as a hobby, but is very quickly turning into a luxury. With how expensive it is to get into gaming, buying a game, buying a console, it ain't cheap. And we often see a lot of these bigger studios throwing tons of money at their game and development cost, which in turn means the game has to sell a ton of copies just to break even and then become profitable, which can become a problem. Some companies do learn their lesson, i.e. Square Enix, their previous president, Yosuke Matsuda. Holy hell, that man was running that company into the ground, greenlighting so many projects, so many expensive projects, getting into blockchain technology, NFTs, really focusing on exclusive titles that seemed great in the short term, but in the long term would hurt the company. Now their current president, Takashi Kiryu, is like, we cannot repeat the mistakes that previous regime did. We can still make our big AAA games, but we got to be more focused on quality over quantity, have fewer of them, and then you're less worried about making tons of money back on all these different games and having all these games come out and then they cannibalize each other. It's a really big mess. And being a smaller studio like Sandfall, they were able to utilize so many different pre-made assets for their games, down to animations and plugins, which is smart. Being able to use pre-existing stuff can smooth over your development time as well as cost. But that's not to say that AAA games don't have their place. Guillaume continues by saying, I think only Rockstar Games is able to meet that demand. Therefore, I think that developers will have to put a cap on budgets, and we will inevitably see more companies settle on a development model like ours. He's right there. Rockstar works on Rockstar time and Rockstar money. And I think it's been rumored, don't quote me on this, but apparently, allegedly, the development cost of Grand Theft Auto 6 is nearing $1 billion. I don't know if that's true. I can see it being true. But that's something Rockstar can do, because Rockstar puts out a Grand Theft Auto, a once-in-a-generation game, and within 24 hours, they've already made a huge chunk of their budget back. That's how insane it is for a company like Rockstar. They are the outlier in this situation. But with that being said, I do think that AAA games still have their place. Obviously, we're going to see way more AA studios pop up and make these high-quality games with modest budgets that find success, but that doesn't mean you can't have the AAAs, you know? And you can have a company like Square Enix, which is starting to put out these HD 2D remasters and completely new IPs that will hopefully find success, which in turn can help fund their bigger projects, which if those bigger projects come out, they could create a cycle where that then helps fund some of the smaller games. Capcom, I think, is a brilliant example of that, where they're in such a good position right now that they can experiment and do these smaller scale, weirder games like a Path of the Goddess, like an Exoprimal, because their bigger franchises are doing really well. And I do want to add, I think there are some people who are under the impression that only the AA studios are real game developers and are super passionate, and the AAA ones are soulless machines with people who don't care. I don't think that's fully the case. Sure, you do have those bigger studios who just kind of run their developers into the ground. Look at Warner Brothers in particular. They clearly didn't learn their lesson with Suicide Squad and now have greenlit another live service game. How many times do we have to go through this lesson, old man? It's insane. And obviously you have those bigger companies that just want to pump out game after game, year after year, and make a ton of money doing so. But I look again at a company like Square Enix, which is trying to find their footing again, but they seem to be very passionate about the games that they make. And the higher-ups at Square Enix don't seem to be too controlling when it comes to telling their developers what to do. We see that with the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy. Those developers at CS1 are making the game they want to make. And having covered so many interviews with those developers over the years, they're very, very passionate about these games. They care. And after playing a game like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, there is so much passion and love and attention to detail put into every square inch of that game. Whether it's the characters, the writing, the environments, how the music is crafted, these people truly care. Another great example would be Sucker Punch. Yes, they're a first-party Sony developer, but Ghost of Tsushima, Ghost of Yotei, they're very, very passionate about those games and how they make them and what goes into them. So you can still have these bigger AAA studios that have passionate development teams that genuinely care about what they're making and seemingly don't have too much red tape that they have to go through when it comes to the higher-ups and the suits that run these companies. But long story short, AAA, AA, they all have their spaces, and there's a time and a place for both of them. And it's pretty cool that we're now entering an era where we can see these AA games stack up to a AAA game, but they can be a little bit easier to develop and make. The downside, with AA games, you do have to wait a little bit longer. Clair Obscur, for example, took, I believe, 5 to 6 years to make, so if you're a fan and you're cool waiting 5 to 6 years, that's not really a big issue. But I think the sweet spot would be somewhere like 3 to 4, depending on the game. But with that being said, that's the video. I am Curious Corduroy. Let me know in the comments down below what you guys thought of this interview with Guillaume Broche talking about turn-based RPGs and where the gaming industry is headed, specifically with more AA studios popping up. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.